right. Let's get this going. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining today's panel, Cloud for Connection, with NHL. I'm joined by Sean Williams, the NHL. Sean, I don't know if you want to start things off and introduce yourself.
Yeah. Sean Williams with the NHL. I oversee our technology partners, not necessarily in a capacity from an IT perspective or a sponsorship perspective, but innovation. And we have a group that's growing within the NHL that's focused on using our technology partners and their software and hardware and cloud systems to try to further the game and grow the game of hockey. So that's my role.
Awesome. And I am Andrew Reich, Senior Industry Specialist, Business Development at AWS and our Media Entertainment Games and Sports Group, and have the pleasure of working with leagues like the NHL and Sean. So, Sean, let's jump right into it. Today's panel is called Cloud for Connection. And, you know, the NHL has really been doing a lot to expand your viewership and connect with fans and use AWS and technology to enable new opportunities to connect with fans. So why don't we just start by, maybe giving us a recap of, last season and heading into this season about, your perspective of how the NHL is doing by bringing more content to its fans.
Yeah, absolutely. So, obviously it's fantastic that we're here today talking about the NHL. We just kicked off our season this week and going into last night. An amazing start to the season. Of course, we are excited with Utah Hockey Club coming on board. They had a big win last night, so that'll be exciting for that franchise. But for us, it's been a great previous season. We have some pretty big numbers. 16 plus million viewers watched our Game 7 over North America, so we're pretty proud of that number. That's the second most watched NHL hockey game ever. Another good stat is that series alone was the second most watched Stanley Cup final series. So that's exciting. And the content continues to keep growing. We have, more content that's going to be distributed this year, obviously with Amazon. And so it's very exciting. So as we look into how to create this content and how to deliver this message and all of these, aspects of the game to consumers, of course, we look at AWS and other technologies to see how we can better provide it.
And one of my favorite things about working with the NHL and how you approach technology is the concept of just ripping the Band-Aid off and trying new things in order to better serve your fans. And when we look at what we did on March 22nd of this year, where we did a cloud broadcast, Carolina Hurricanes versus the Washington Capitals, our whole game main feed was produced in the cloud, aired on NHL Network, and we also had an alternate feed. I mean, I think that was a huge milestone for us, but also in the industry, because now we had a league that's producing the game all using cloud technology. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that from your perspective?
Yeah, so it was very exciting, and it was a goal that we had set a long time ago, but it really did start back in 2021, where we started to look at our infrastructure and say, what do we need to get to the next level? And obviously with our partnership with AWS, we looked at a cloud-based encoding and scheduling system. And so in 21, we put that into production, obviously refined it over a few years. And once that system was up and running, looked at what's next, like what else can we do within our content creation systems to better help our production groups. So looked at cloud production. Obviously there's a lot happening in the regional sports network space. And so we wanted to make sure we had the right tool set in order to churn to our clubs or even churn to our national broadcasters and say, hey, here's a proven solution. We're not saying it's the solution, but it's a solution that we have tested. We know it works, and these are kind of the requirements that you need. So starting in 2023, during our tech showcase out in Seattle, we kind of kicked the tires with cloud broadcasting, made sure everything worked, connected all the pieces, made sure all of the vendors were integrated in one way or the other, learned a lot about what doesn't integrate and what does. And then, of course, after that, we went into a couple more pilots and tests where we actually started to get folks who are actually producing and get their hands on it. So we had the Melbourne Games, the Global Series in late 2023. And then going into this last season, we had many different pilots that were behind closed doors where we were putting folks, specifically our NHL network folks, in front of these systems and in front of switchers and in front of all kinds of hardware to say, okay, this is a cloud-based system. You're switching in the cloud. What do you like? What do you not like? What works? What doesn't work? And we learned a lot. And so coming out of that, we then finally set and pointed towards the goal of getting one game produced last year and succeeded on what you were talking about, March 22nd.
And one of my favorite parts of March 22nd is, so obviously we had the main production feed where, we had operators in Secaucus, New Jersey, where, if the game was taking place in Washington, D.C., everything was hosted in the cloud, and all this, the servers and the workstations were accessed remotely. Everything was being hosted on AWS, so that was for the main production. But then also what we were able to do with those feeds running through AWS is we were able to create and play around with an alternate broadcast focused on NHL Edge IQ, the analytics platform that AWS and NHL are working together, but that alternate broadcast. And the feeds were running through AWS. And that production wasn't produced on AWS, but the feeds were running through AWS. And I love that because it said, okay, we don't have to do everything on AWS, but we can use some of the components to enable more storytelling and more content creation. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about NHL Edge Unlock and this idea of the alternate broadcasts?
Yeah. So, obviously across all sports, all the leagues, this idea of alternate broadcast is growing. And everyone's trying it. Everyone's testing it out, kicking tires, especially at, the national level. So that pilot that you're referring to, NHL Edge Unlocked, that was a stats heavy pilot. We were happy with it. What came out of it was really, really, serendipitous in that our friends over at TNT, obviously had been testing and trialing different alternate broadcasts. And so they looked at us and said, okay, we like what you've done. We'd like to take our own spin on it and actually bring it to, Western Conference Finals. So during the 6 games during the Western Conference Finals, TNT had their own alternate broadcast. And again, going back to kind of the theme I mentioned earlier, we were able to turn to TNT and say, okay, so here's what it looked like. Go ahead and watch back the VOD. We've got these tools with AWS. We've got these tools with Evertz. We've got these tools with all these different technology providers. What do you guys need? And, to be frank, TNT didn't go all cloud broadcast on that specific alt broadcast because, they have their infrastructure and they have their way of getting things done. But there were certain elements where they kind of raised their hand to say, hey, we need some assistance and we need some help. Can you guys help us? And of course, we did. And leading into that was very successful, but that unlocked and opened more doors for more alternate broadcasts. So during our finals, we, the NHL, specifically NHL Network, produced an additional alternate broadcast, with American Sign Language. So this was something that was done in our studios at our headquarters, again, leveraging some of the AWS cloud technology that we had piloted and tested out. And it brought another alternate broadcast during all of the finals games.
And once again, the story that I love there is using Media Connect and using some of the technologies to unlock the opportunity to help make your life easier to produce this alternate broadcast. Again, I'm not saying, oh, overnight, everyone lean in all AWS for your production. No, because that's not realistic. But where you all have leaned in is you're using the services and the technology to make your life easier to create more content. And I think that's what's really important.
Yeah. And I guess, to further build on, obviously this whole journey started with our exploring cloud broadcasting. But as, we look at our fans and we look at what they want, it's more content. It's content that is specific to them, that's targeted to them. So anything from an avid fan, who wants a stats heavy alternate broadcast to things like, broadcasts that are targeted at youth. So we've had a lot of success with a bunch of our national partners around, you guys may have seen it, our Big City Green show, as well as, an alternate broadcast that we did with TNT called Metaverses. And of course, last year we did one with our local, regional sports network in Chicago. And so we are going to grow that offering. And part in part, we know we need it. We know we need to deliver more content to fans that are specifically growing certain segments of the audience. In this particular example, it's youth. But we want to get to a point where we can offer it across all of our clubs. And some of that is limited on technology. So previous to this season, we had Hawkeye only installed in a few of our arenas, but we need Hawkeye in order to create all of the data points that build a virtual game recreation. And this year we will have Hawkeye in all of our arenas across North America, including Canada. And that will allow us and enable us and empower our teams internally to work with our local regional sports networks as well as our clubs to give them the tools to bring virtual game recreation and put their own spin on it too, right? It's one thing to have ESPN and have Disney IP, but we've heard from our clubs and we know that our clubs are looking to do their own spin on these virtual game recreations, and we're excited for that.
And once again, I think this idea of all these different alternate broadcasts, I mean, I would imagine you're finding that it's bringing in, you mentioned youth and different demographics, and ultimately going back and growing the game and bringing in more fans.
Yeah, absolutely. And we as an industry, sports as an industry is at a pivotal moment. I don't know how many people have been on a stage and said that in the last 2 years. But there's going to be this transition, and from the NHL perspective, we have a very specific strategy, which is the old model and the old way we used to do things just will not work. The viewership numbers won't necessarily be there. So how do we drive those numbers up? How do we provide something that is tangibly valuable so that we could go to obviously streaming services or national networks and give them the value that they need to make the cost investment logical and a good investment at the end of the day. And that is by creating more content. So it's creating these alternate broadcasts. It's creating virtual content. It's creating whip around shows that are, highlights of what's happening now, what happened moments ago, and kind of break free of the old mold that we're used to having, which has, unfortunately held, a lot of, sports contracts and sports agreements back.
And you mentioned whip around show, which leads into my next question. So recently there was a Sports Video Group article that came out about the NHL and the collaboration with Prime Video and AWS. Basically Monday Night Hockey for fans in Canada, and also the Coast to Coast show, the Whip Around show on Thursday nights for fans in Canada. Why don't you talk a little, would love to hear your perspective on, some of the efforts with Prime Video. If there's any additional context that you could provide from, maybe some of the article didn't cover, I think that would be awesome.
Yeah. So obviously, we're very excited with that relationship. Definitely out of my purview as far as those conversations. But, the one thing we are going to lean into, and we've had good conversations, is what else could we do throughout the season, right? So, Prime Monday Night Hockey is going to be a centerpiece for, Canadians. For us as consumers living in the United States, that is as big of a show, if not larger, than Monday night's football for us. So there's a lot we can do. And again, going back to cloud production and testing out and proving that technology, we're not churning to Amazon to say this is the solution. Obviously, Amazon has their own, network of technologists who understand the solution, as well as us. But at least us and our IT teams and our groups that led that project, they can churn to, their colleagues over on the Prime team and say, hey, this is what works. This is what doesn't work. We've proven it out. We know we've got a solution that can bring alternate broadcasts, can bring more content to fans, especially diehard Canadians in Canada.
Well, that's awesome. And overall, I think, going back to the original theme of cloud enablement and using it, the different tools, again, not approaching it as an all or nothing, but chipping away using some tools here, some tools there to ultimately enable more content creation. Overall, how do you see really cloud really helping to enable the NHL to accomplish that?
So I think for us to enable more content creation, obviously it's a, it's a give and take relationship with our rights holders. So they, at the end of the day, have the distribution network as far as understanding what they want to put out, what they can't put out. And we'll have to be flexible from a legal perspective. But again, coming back to our desire to grow the game of hockey, we are going to always push and always enable them to create more content. And, at the end of the day, if there's something that makes sense for both sides, we're going to make it happen. I think some of the other leagues might have to be more limiting just given their contracts and their agreements they have in place. But again, for us to, continue down the path that we're going and follow the strategy that we're going, we've got to create more content that hits specific audiences.
And going back to, another big component of in addition to the video and the encoding and scheduling and the live cloud production, obviously, we hit upon the alternate broadcast focused around datacast and the analytics and everything we're doing around NHL Edge IQ. What do you kind of see the future of analytics with what AWS and NHL are working on? Maybe how that could be, woven into broadcasts or just some of the technology components with fucking player tracking data. What do you see the future of that?
Yeah, I mean, from our perspective, a fan who's watching the game, if there's more information that you can provide to them in order for them to kind of enjoy and consume and get more out of that experience, that's a huge win. It's obvious that hockey is a fast game. We don't have the benefits that, say, American football has with the downtime in between each play. So from our broadcaster's perspective, when they throw to a color commentator, it's seconds. Like it is a short comment. It is following up on something that may have happened 3 shifts ago. And that's tough. That's tough from a storytelling perspective. Again, whereas other sports, especially in the United States, they have that time and they can fill the gap. We don't have that. So if we're looking to provide more value to fans as they watch the game of hockey, things like advanced stats and analytics will help, but it's got to be snackable. It's got to be short. It's got to be something that makes sense. It can't be, a long-winded explanation as to how exactly the ice is tilting one way or the other. It's got to have some graphical representation, and that graphical representation, has to be able to click in a hockey fan's mind, both an adult who's maybe played the sport of hockey all the way down to, your classic hockey mom that didn't get the chance to play the sport, but understands it from, watching their kids on the ice. So that's a challenge. And that's a challenge that obviously we're partnering with AWS and we work on. But, we also, we look to a lot of fan segmentation. We do a lot of research and analysis to understand what works with our fans, what doesn't work with our fans. And it's tough. It's not easy. We always fall back on highlighting, face-off probability. So for those who haven't seen face-off probability, it's something that we've had for about 2 years now, invested a lot of time, money, and effort into it. But basically, as the 2 teams come up to the face-off circle, there's a system that's looking at a long-standing history of data. They're looking at the 2 centermen who are going to be facing off. What is their history together? Where are they on the ice? What other players are on the ice? Where are we from a game score perspective? And it's calculating all of this in real time using AI to basically produce a estimated or predicted outcome. So that is something that we've had on hockey broadcast for a while now, but we want more of that. So working with AWS, I think we're there. We've got some big wins that we've tested out last year, but we want to keep doing more of that.
Well, and I remember, last year at the stadium series, what we saw at MetLife Stadium, where the face-off probability was updating in real time as different skaters were, they were skating around, and it kept updating what the probability was. And then when finally the 2 skaters, were ready to face off, it landed on that. And to see those numbers updating in real time, it showed that I think the technology there, in addition to, ultra low latency, because when you're in the stadium and you're watching it in real time, you want what's going on the scoreboard to match what you're seeing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And with you kind of going down that path and highlighting that specific example, it kind of brings me back to when we were working with your team as well as our IT teams last year, and just kind of like highlighting the efforts that we put towards cloud broadcasting. And again, kind of coming back to this theme that we've kind of said over and over again with this panel of, from our team's perspective, it wasn't something we churned on overnight. It was something that took many years for us to test out, to prove that it worked. And through all of those pilots and all of those tests, we learned a lot. And so when you go back to something like, face-off probability and integrating that into cloud broadcasts, even little elements like that are, regional and our national networks had figured out, we had to kind of find the solution and figure it out ourselves working with NHL Network. And we wouldn't have had that opportunity if we didn't try these pilots and work on the sidelines.
And you brought up an interesting point about kind of the iterations and the testing. Similarly on the video encoders and coding side, as we've discussed kind of the footprint at all these different arenas and kind of the rinse and repeat across the league, maybe talk a little bit about what that's like of working with some of the different venues and, if you want to pull feeds from, say now Utah or Vegas, kind of what that process is like. Ultimately, where I think you all really leaned in, which was great, was you built the foundation of that encoding and scheduling pipeline. You understood, okay, here's the ingest, here's the distribution, here's how we acquire and send out all the content. Now that we have our video in the cloud, we can do so many different cool things. But I guess just talk a little bit about the process of across the arenas with the signals.
Yeah. And what I would say first is, and just looking at the clock, Noah, kind of wrapping up is kind of a big takeaway for everyone in the audience. From our perspective, that our introduction in the cloud was started with our technology team back in 2021. And that has taken that amount of time to get to the scale that we are today. From our perspective, we had to start small and we had to slowly build the scheduling and encoding system. That took time. Obviously, it took time to work with AWS and our other vendors. And so for anyone who's looking to get some type of broadcast into the cloud, the one thing I would throw out there, just be frank and be very open with all of the technology vendors, because everyone's looking for that opportunity to test stuff out. Our technology group has a laundry list of vendors that we use. I don't even understand like the majority of them, but they do. And our technology team is testing everything. They're trying everything. They're learning to understand who exactly works for our needs. And from what I've seen and from what I've been a part of, all of those vendors are embracing cloud because they know that it has a place in the future, and it has most likely a very big place in the future. So, one takeaway I would say is, don't be hesitant to turn to a vendor and push them and say, hey, I want to do this. I want to test it out. I want to pilot it out. How can I do this so that I can afford it in this day and age, and that it's not something that breaks the bank? Because from us, I mean, we challenged AWS too to say, all right, so we've kicked the tires. We've done this. We've made this all work. All right, Andrew, what is this going to cost to the NHL? Come on, Andrew, what is this going to cost? How come you haven't delivered that? We've said that multiple times, and we're slowly getting there. But I think the answer to that joke is that not a lot of us know. We're still kind of defining the requirements. We're still understanding what it costs. What does a license mean for one game versus an entire year? And, we'll get there eventually, but the only way to actually, have a seat at the table is to test and to pilot and to prove it out.
Right. And to your point, we're seeing all, the overarching benefits and use case of where this comes into play of when we think about space and we think about, being able to spin up for March 22nd, just weeks in advance to do a main production, but also, we have the feeds. Let's try something new. And when we think about the sustainability and that from that game that reduced 2.05 metric tons of carbon, which is the equivalent of growing 30 to 34 trees and letting them grow for 10 years. So like when we look at all the impacts, to your point, since it is still fairly new, it is here and we're doing it, but we're discovering a lot of those artifacts as we go. Like the metric tons of carbon, we only found that out because we actually did it and we calculated, well, how many people didn't travel and we didn't ship gear and we didn't roll another production truck. we didn't have that number before we did it. So to your point, you're learning more about all this by trying and testing. And I think that goes back to what I said before about ripping the Band-Aid off and really just going for it, testing it. And I love to see that you're getting, advantages from it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I would just say, kind of in closing, relative to this topic and the National Hockey League, we're excited. Obviously, our partnership with AWS fundamentally, is cemented and grounded in testing out cloud production. And obviously, we've kind of highlighted the need to test and be at the table and actually pilot this technology out. But again, for us, we're obviously sustainability is an important part, but we realize that this is not an end all be all solution. This is a solution that is going to fit when it needs to fit. And we're not churning to our broadcast partners and forcing them into this perspective of, technology infrastructure, but we at least know that it works. And we at least know that if we need to fill a gap when the time comes, that we have it.
Awesome. No, I couldn't have said it better myself. And likewise, I love the relationship with the NHL and your willingness to innovate. But overall, really appreciate the time, Sean. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining, and have a great rest of your show.